The crystal glass slips from my stepfather's hand and shatters across the floor. Nobody moves. His face turns pale as he stares at the business card my fiancé just placed in front of him. A second ago, everyone at the engagement dinner was laughing at me. Now the entire restaurant is silent. My stepfather slowly reads the card again. No, he whispers. My fiancé folds his hands on the table like he's discussing the weather. I told you, he says calmly, I'm not here for your money. My stepfather looks up. You're the buyer. Yes. The company. I'm leading the group that's making the final decision. The smile disappears from my stepfather's face. Around us, forks stop moving. My mother looks from him to my fiancé, confused. My cousins exchange nervous glances. Just 1 minute ago, everyone applauded after my stepfather stood up and announced, "If you marry her, don't expect a penny from this family." They thought I would cry. Instead, everything has changed. Then my fiancé reaches into his jacket and pulls out another folder. I also found something else, he says. My stepfather's hands begin to shake. And that's the moment I realize, tonight isn't just about our engagement anymore. It's about every lie he's hidden for the last 15 years. My name is Skylar Bennett, I'm 27 years old, and I'm telling this because sometimes the people who humiliate you in public end up exposing themselves in front of the same crowd. For most of my life, I believed family was something you fought to keep. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, where everyone knew everyone. After my dad passed away when I was 10, my mom married Richard Lawson 2 years later. At first, Richard acted like the perfect stepfather. He bought me birthday presents. He came to my school plays. He called me his daughter. But after the wedding, everything changed. He never hit me. He never shouted loud enough for neighbors to hear. Instead, he became something much harder to explain. Every compliment came with an insult. Every success somehow became his achievement. Every mistake became proof that I wasn't good enough. You should be grateful, he loved saying. I gave you this life. When I got accepted into college, he laughed. Community college would fit you better. When I earned scholarships, he told relatives he had paid for everything. When I graduated with honors, he introduced me as my wife's daughter. Not his daughter. Never his daughter. My mom always found excuses. He's under pressure. He doesn't mean it. Just ignore him. So I did. I built my own life. I became a marketing manager. I rented my own apartment. I made friends who actually celebrated my achievements. Then 2 years ago, I met Mason Brooks. Unlike everyone Richard admired, Mason never bragged. He drove an ordinary SUV. He wore simple clothes. He remembered birthdays. He listened more than he talked. Our first date lasted 6 hours because neither of us wanted to leave. By the 3rd month, I knew I wanted forever. Richard disagreed immediately. What does he do? He works in business. What business? He invests. Richard laughed. So unemployed with fancy words. Mason only smiled. I understand why you'd think that. Richard mistook kindness for weakness. He had no idea who Mason really was. Neither did I. Not completely. Whenever I asked about work, Mason kept things simple. My partners and I buy struggling companies and rebuild them. That sounded ordinary enough. I never pushed for details. Our relationship wasn't built on money. It was built on trust. When Mason proposed during a weekend trip to the Smoky Mountains, I said yes before he even finished asking. I called Mom first. She cried. Richard grabbed the phone. When's dinner? What dinners? The engagement dinner. He insisted on hosting it. Family should celebrate these moments. Something about his voice made me nervous. Mason squeezed my hand. If it feels wrong, we don't have to go. I shook my head. I've spent years hoping things would get better. Maybe, just maybe, this could be a fresh start. I couldn't have been more wrong. Dinner was held at the nicest steakhouse in downtown Nashville. Nearly 30 relatives came. Aunts, uncles, cousins, even family friends I hadn't seen in years. Richard loved an audience. Halfway through dessert, he stood and tapped his glass. I'd like everyone's attention. The room became quiet. He smiled at Mason. I've watched young people make emotional decisions before. People chuckled politely. I have nothing against love. Another pause. But marriage is also about responsibility. He turned toward me. Skylar has always expected things to come easily. I froze. What are you talking about? He ignored me. If you marry hers. He looked directly at Mason. Don't expect a penny from this family. The room exploded with applause. Some people laughed. Others nodded. My own mother looked down at her plate without saying a word. Richard spread his arms proudly. My money stays with people who respect this family. I felt every pair of eyes land on me. Years of embarrassment. Years of being treated like I wasn't enough. All happening again. Right in front of everyone. I wanted to disappear. Instead, Mason stood up slowly. He smiled, reached into his jacket, pulled out one simple business card, and handed it to Richard. I'm not here for your money. Richard smirked. Oh, I'm here to discuss buying your company. The laughter stopped instantly. Richard looked down at the card. His confident smile slowly faded. Then Mason quietly added, and after reviewing some recent financial records, I think we need to have a much bigger conversation. Richard didn't answer right away. He kept staring at Mason's business card like it had changed languages. You've got 5 seconds to explain this, he finally said. Mason stayed calm. I'd rather explain it somewhere private. Richard forced a laugh and looked around the room. Everyone, don't worry, this is just some business misunderstanding. But nobody was laughing anymore. One by one, our relatives quietly returned to their meals while secretly watching us. Richard asked Mason to step into a private dining room. Before the door closed, Mason looked at me. Trust me. I nodded even though my heart was racing. 20 minutes later, Richard walked out looking nothing like the confident man who had embarrassed me in front of everyone. His tie was loose. His face had lost all its color. He didn't even look at me before leaving the restaurant. The dinner ended early. Nobody knew what had happened. Not even me. On the drive home, I finally asked Mason, "Who are you reallys?" He smiled. "The same man you agreed to marry." "I know that. But there's something you haven't told me." He took a deep breath. "My investment firm has been reviewing Lawson Industrial for months." I blinked. "My stepfather's company." "Yes. I thought you invested in small businesses." "We do. Sometimes we also acquire companies that have potential but poor leadership." Everything suddenly made sense. The late-night meetings. The unexpected business trips. The confidential phone calls. You knew Richard on the company. I did. And you never told me. I wanted you to know I loved you before you knew what I did. I couldn't even be upset. Looking back, I realized he had never hidden anything. I had simply never asked. The next morning, my phone exploded with messages. Some relatives apologized for staying silent. Others defended Richard. He was just joking. You took it too seriously. Family says crazy things. But one message stood out. It came from my cousin Emma. "Can we meet? There's something you deserve to know." We met that afternoon at a small coffee shop outside downtown Nashville. Emma looked nervous. "I've stayed quiet for years," she admitted. "But after last night, I can't anymore." She slid a thick envelope across the table. Inside were copies of emails, company documents, property records. I frowned. What is all this? Richard has been moving company assets into other accounts. Is that even legal? I don't know. But several employees were blamed for missing money they never touched. My stomach tightened. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because I work in accounting." She looked down. "And because I can't watch him destroy more people." That evening, I handed the envelope to Mason. He carefully flipped through every page. Finally, he looked up. "This changes everything." "What do you mean?" "We suspected financial problems." He tapped the documents. "This suggests something much bigger." For the next 2 weeks, our apartment became mission control. Emma quietly gathered more records. A retired manager agreed to speak after leaving the company. Even one of Richard's former business partners reached out with information. Each conversation revealed another piece of the puzzle. The man who always claimed to protect his company had actually been hurting the people who trusted him most. Still, Mason reminded me of one thing every single day. This isn't about revenge for one embarrassing dinner. It's about letting the truth speak for itself. And soon, Richard was about to learn that the people he underestimated had been paying attention all along. 2 weeks later, everything was in motion. Richard still believed he was in control. He walked into his office every morning with the same confidence, smiling for employees as if nothing had happened at the engagement dinner. But behind the scenes, the ground beneath him was already shifting. Mason's investment group officially entered the final stage of negotiations to purchase Lawson Industrial. Richard had no choice but to cooperate. The company needed outside funding after losing several major contracts, and only a handful of buyers were still interested. He wanted the deal. He just didn't realize every meeting was revealing more than he intended. One afternoon, Mason invited me to sit in on a strategy session with his legal and financial team. Stacks of reports covered the conference table. One attorney looked up. "We've verified the documents Emma provided." Another added, "Several transactions don't match the official records." I stared at the papers. "So what happens now?" Mason folded his hands. "Now we let Richard tell his own story." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "He thinks nobody has noticed the contradictions." He smiled slightly. "So we're going to let him explain them himself." A few days later, Richard hosted a presentation for potential investors at the company's headquarters. Executives, board members, consultants, everyone important was there. I almost didn't attend. Walking into that building brought back years of painful memories. Richard noticed me immediately. "I didn't expect you. I'm here to support my fiancé." His smile looked forced. "Of course." For the next hour, Richard gave the performance of his life. He spoke about leadership, integrity, family values, employee loyalty. Listening to him felt surreal. This was the same man who had spent years making me feel invisible. Then came the question and answer session. Mason stood. "Excellent presentation." Richard relaxed. "Thank you. I have a few questions regarding the financial summaries." "Go ahead." A large screen displayed one of the reports. Mason pointed to a highlighted section. "Can you explain why these company assets appear under two different ownership structures?" Richard answered immediately. "That's standard accounting." Another expert quietly shook his head. "It isn't." The room became noticeably quieter. Mason changed to the next slide. "This property was transferred 3 times within 6 months." Richard cleared his throat. "Business restructuring." Another document appeared. "What about these employee bonuses that were approved but never distributed?" Richard hesitated. "There must be an administrative delay." One board member leaned forward. "Our records show those funds disappeared months ago." Richard looked around the room. For the first time in my life. He had no clever response. His confidence began slipping away. "I'll have accounting clarify that." Emma slowly stood from the back of the room. "I already can." Every head turned toward her. She walked calmly to the front. "I prepared many of these reports." Richard's face tightened. "Emma, sit down." She ignored him. "The original files are different from the versions presented today." The projector switched again. This time both versions appeared side by side. Even I could see the differences. Numbers had changed. Dates had moved. Entire entries were missing. The room filled with whispers. Richard slammed his hand on the table. "This is ridiculous." One board member calmly replied. Then explaining it should be easy. Instead, Richard gathered his papers. "This meeting is over." "No," Mason said quietly. "It isn't." He handed each board member another folder. Inside were signed statements from former managers, accounting records, and emails that supported everything Emma had revealed. No shouting. No dramatic accusations. Just facts. One by one, the board members silently read the documents. The chairman finally spoke. "We'll need an independent review before moving forward." Richard looked directly at me. For years, I had been the person he embarrassed. The one he dismissed. The one nobody believed. Now, for the first time, he was the one standing alone while everyone else questioned him. As the meeting ended, employees gathered in the hallway, whispering about what they had just witnessed. Some looked shocked. Others simply looked relieved. Outside the building, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. Mason wrapped his arm around my shoulders. How do you feel? I watch people leaving the headquarters in silence. I thought revenge would make me happy. And it doesn't. He looked at me. It makes me feel free. But our biggest confrontation was still ahead. Because Richard had just sent me one final message. If you want the whole truth, come to the house tomorrow, alone. I stared at the screen. After 15 years, he was finally ready to talk. Or so he wanted me to believe. I barely slept that night. Richard's message kept replaying in my mind. If you want the whole truth, come to the house tomorrow, alone. Mason looked at me over breakfast. You don't have to go. I know. But I need answers. He reached across the table and squeezed my hand. If you need me, I'm 5 minutes away. I smiled. I'll be okay. The house looked exactly the same as it had for years. The white porch. The perfectly trimmed bushes. The place where I had spent so much of my childhood trying to earn approval that was never going to come. Richard opened the door before I knocked. He looked older than I remembered. Not because of time. Because the confidence was gone. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, he stepped aside. Come in. The living room was silent. No television. No music. Even my mother wasn't there. I asked her to visit your aunt, Richard said. I thought we should talk without interruptions. I stayed standing. You said you were finally going to tell the truth. He nodded slowly. I was. He stared at the family photos hanging on the wall. You always thought I disliked you. You made that pretty clear. He sighed. When I married your mother, Lawson Industrial was already struggling. I folded my arms. So, I believed if people saw me supporting another man's daughter more than my own business, they'd think I was weak. I almost laughed. So your solution was to embarrass me for 15 years. I convinced myself it would make you stronger. His words felt empty. You didn't make me stronger. You made me believe I wasn't worth loving. He looked down. I know. Silence filled the room. Then he walked to a cabinet and placed a thick folder on the coffee table. I've already signed my resignation. I blinked. What? The board accepted it this morning. He slid the papers toward me. I also transferred my voting shares. To who? You. I stared at him. I don't want your company. I know. Then why? Because it's the only thing I have left to apologize with. I pushed the folder back. No. His eyebrows lifted. I'm not taking something just because I finally have the chance. You earned it. No. I looked him directly in the eyes. I earned my own life. The room became quiet again. For the first time since I had known him, Richard didn't have another speech prepared. Just then the front door opened. My mother stepped inside. She looked from me to Richard. I couldn't stay away. Richard nodded. I told her everything. Mom's eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Skylar. I had waited years to hear those words. But they didn't erase the past. I needed you. I know. You watched everything happen. She nodded slowly. I was afraid. I was too. She walked closer. I don't expect forgiveness today. You won't get it today. She accepted my answer without arguing. For the first time, someone in this family was taking responsibility instead of making excuses. A week later, the board officially announced a complete restructuring of Lawson Industrial. New leadership stepped in. Independent experts reviewed every department. Employees who had been unfairly blamed finally had the opportunity to clear their names. Emma accepted a senior finance position under the new management. She earned it. As for Mason's investment group, they moved forward with the acquisition, but only after the company adopted stricter oversight and protections for its employees. Life slowly returned to normal. 3 months later, Mason and I stood on a quiet beach in Charleston, South Carolina, surrounded by close friends instead of hundreds of guests. No giant ballroom. No dramatic speeches. No family performance. Just people who genuinely wanted to celebrate with us. As I walked toward Mason, I realized something. The engagement dinner had felt like the worst night of my life. Looking back, it was actually the night my future began. Not because Richard lost everything he thought mattered, but because I finally stopped letting him decide what I was worth. When the ceremony ended, Mason smiled at me. Any regrets? I looked at the ocean, then back at the people cheering around us. Just one. What's that? I should have believed in myself years earlier. He laughed softly. I've believed in you from the very beginning. I squeezed his hand. And for the first time in a very long time. Home wasn't a house. It wasn't an inheritance. It wasn't a family name. Home was the life I had built with people who chose respect over control. Richard's applause had once filled an entire restaurant. But in the end, the quiet peace I found afterward was louder than anything he had ever said.